Hubertine Auclert and the birth of La Citoyenne. Have you ever pictured yourself in the heart of 19th century Paris, where cafes buzz with lively chatter and artists dream up new masterpieces in cramped studios? That was the world on February 13, 1881, when a determined woman named Hubertine Auclert decided she'd had enough of being ignored. Her response was a radical magazine called La Citoyenne. Imagine strolling past a crowded newsstand on a chilly morning. Maybe you're smelling fresh bread from the bakery next door and spotting a bold headline that practically shouts, "Women are citizens too." That's what happened on that day, and it shook the city's foundations more than anyone expected. The Paris of 1881 was still finding its footing after the turmoil of war and political upheaval. People wandered the streets, debating everything from democracy to new engineering ideas, but women were still expected to stay in the background. Society prized them as wives and mothers, not thinkers or leaders. Even so, there were whispers of discontent. Some women were starting to exchange letters and attend small gatherings, trying to figure out why the promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity never seemed to apply to them. Most of these efforts were dismissed as pipe dreams, until Hubertine Auclert stepped forward with a fierce resolve to demand real change. Hubertine's life began in the Auvergne region of France in 1848. She was orphaned as a teenager, found herself in a convent for a while, and constantly questioned why women were stuck under the thumb of men, whether it was a father, a husband, or the law itself. She was no stranger to making bold moves. Early in her activism, she marched straight to government offices, petition in hand, insisting that women deserved the right to vote. People laughed her off as if she were suggesting something outlandish, but she never backed down. In her mind, if France wanted to be a true republic, it couldn't ignore half its population. That's where La Citoyenne came in. Hubertine knew that to reach beyond her small circle of supporters, she needed something that would land right on people's doorstep, something they couldn't dismiss so easily. A magazine was the perfect tool. On its launch date, anyone who picked up La Citoyenne was greeted with a fiery statement: women deserve full equality, including the right to vote. This wasn't some mild editorial piece. It was a declaration that France couldn't keep pretending to be the world's beacon of democracy while shutting women out of the polling booths. Right on the cover, the word citoyenne, meaning woman citizen, dared society to recognize that women weren't just passive onlookers. From page 1, Hubertine spelled out exactly what she was after: the same rights and freedoms that men already had. She wrote about how it was hypocritical to celebrate universal male suffrage if every woman was still legally considered a minor. Then she backed it all up with statistics about women's wages, stories of wives who had lost everything once their husbands died, and teachers paid a pittance compared to their male colleagues. It wasn't just theory or lofty ideals. La Citoyenne brought real voices and real struggles into the spotlight. Before long, the reactions poured in. Some people loved the magazine, applauding it for finally speaking truths nobody else dared to. Others were furious. Conservatives especially saw Hubertine as a threat to the very fabric of society. Some hurled insults, calling her a troublemaker or worse. Cartoons mocked her as someone who was trying to tear apart traditional families. But instead of hiding from these attacks, she put them right on display in her magazine, then answered them with calm, logical responses. By tackling each objection head-on, like the old claim that women were too emotional to vote, she turned critics' words into fuel for her growing movement. As word spread, La Citoyenne gained traction beyond Paris. Reading circles popped up in living rooms and back rooms of cafes, where groups of women, and sometimes supportive men, gathered to discuss each new edition. Articles from respected feminist writers appeared, and a few forward-thinking male allies wrote in too. Donations trickled in just enough to keep the presses running. And while the magazine never made Hubertine wealthy, it gave her a platform that reached far beyond the city limits. Soon, people as far away as Britain, the United States, and Australia were writing letters of solidarity. Yet, maintaining a magazine that tackled such a controversial topic wasn't easy. Hubertine poured most of her own savings into it, often risking her personal well-being. Social invitations dried up. She got threatening mail, was ridiculed in public, and faced resistance from every corner. Still, she refused to slow down. She wrote tirelessly, challenging the men in power to prove that they were truly progressive. After all, if men were so proud of their modern republic, how could they justify leaving women voiceless? Little by little, these arguments began to make dents in public opinion. Newspapers that had once ignored La Citoyenne started quoting it. Politicians found themselves forced to talk about women's suffrage, even if just to dismiss it. But they couldn't ignore it anymore. It was in the air. People were finally asking questions that seemed unthinkable just a decade earlier. Even some of the most conservative folks were starting to wonder, could the idea of women voting really be that crazy? To understand why La Citoyenne made such a splash, it helps to remember that the Third Republic was still fairly new. Universal male suffrage itself was a recent development, and workers' movements were already shaking up the status quo. The stage was set for big shifts, and Hubertine Auclert seized that moment. She linked women's suffrage to the broader ideals of liberty that France loved to champion. Suddenly, ignoring women's voices felt less like tradition and more like hypocrisy. Even if not everyone agreed with her, the conversation had started. Of course, legal change doesn't happen overnight. In France, women wouldn't get the right to vote until 1944. That's more than 6 decades after Hubertine launched her magazine. But La Citoyenne laid the groundwork. It kept pointing out injustices, spotlighting real experiences, and rallying both women and men who believed that democracy should include everyone. It was a slow battle, marked by setbacks and small victories. Yet each time the government sidestepped the issue, more people took notice. If we look back on it now, La Citoyenne matters because it shows how one determined person with a clear vision can change an entire conversation. In a world without social media or instantaneous global news, this one magazine reverberated beyond French borders. Hubertine Auclert proved that ideas catch fire when shared bravely and consistently. She didn't just want to say women should have rights. She forced people to see the consequences of ignoring half the population. Her work resonates today because many places around the world still wrestle with questions of equality, whether for women or for other marginalized groups. Picture yourself, once more, in that bustling Paris street, grabbing a fresh copy of La Citoyenne. You flip through the pages, your eyes catching stories about unfair pay, legal hurdles, and personal tragedies. But you also see hope, courage, and a demand for progress. This wasn't a dusty theoretical journal. It was a bold rallying cry, one that said we won't be invisible anymore. That sense of urgency and passion is what makes Hubertine Auclert's story so powerful. She risked social isolation, financial difficulties, and threats of violence just to keep publishing. Week after week, month after month, she insisted that people pay attention. And eventually, they did. Her unwavering stance opened the door for the next generation of suffragists, who kept fighting until victory was finally won. Now, if hearing about La Citoyenne and the spark it ignited in French society has moved you, there are plenty of ways to dig deeper. Lots of books and articles explore how women's suffrage evolved not only in France but also worldwide. You might find stories of equally brave women in other countries who took similar stands, sometimes even inspired by the writings of Hubertine and her peers. They all shared that stubborn refusal to accept life as it was, a refusal that shaped history in ways most people never imagine. In the end, La Citoyenne stands as proof that big changes often start from small beginnings. A single printed page can shift the thinking of a community, a nation, and even the world. Hubertine Auclert reminds us that when justice is at stake, we can't just wait for someone else to fix things. We have to speak up, write it down, pass it around, and keep pushing until those in power have no choice but to listen. So as you sit here now, letting this story sink in, think about the kind of world you want. Hubertine Auclert had a vision where liberty, equality, and fraternity truly included everyone. If she managed to stir a revolution with a single magazine, imagine what's possible in our hyper-connected world. It's a legacy that urges each of us to find our voice, to recognize injustice, and to challenge it. After all, the echoes of La Citoyenne can still be felt whenever someone stands up and says, "We deserve better," and means it. So if you found inspiration in this chapter of history, if you felt the pulse of excitement at seeing how one determined voice changed the course of a nation, do more than just watch. Take action. Check out the links in the description and the first pinned comment for more insights into the women's suffrage movement in France and around the world. Explore the recommended reading list to dive deeper into the lives of fearless women like Hubertine Auclert. If you believe in keeping history alive and relevant, subscribe, like, and share this video. Your engagement helps these stories reach the next generation so that they, too, may carry the torch of equality forward. Remember, history is more than dusty pages. It's alive in us. Each day, we write our own paragraphs in the grand narrative of the human struggle for dignity and justice. Let's ensure, as Hubertine Auclert did, that we write it boldly.